previous breath. Now if he inhales 1,500, he gets that plus fresh air. This is going to work out okay for him, probably. But those are deep breaths. 1,500 milliliters is like that. So his problem here is that he has an amount of airspace which is not useful to him, but which he must nevertheless clear every time he breathes. We call this dead space. And if you want to calculate how much useful air he gets out of every breath, you have to subtract the dead space. That's considered stale air from his previous exhalations. So not very useful.
Dead space one more time.
So every time he breathes in, the first 1,000 milliliters that he gets are previously exhaled air that's just gone to filling that space.
Yeah.
So that first amount, that first 1,000 is stale. We call that dead space. This is a space that whenever he inhales, he'll get that first, and it's not useful space for him. He has to clear that before he gets any fresh air.
So he has to clear the 1,000 before he gets any fresh air?
Yes. Since that 1,000 will be occupied by his last exhalation, the first air he gets is that old air.
Is this related to the anatomical dead space?
It is. We're about to get to that. Now, as was suggested just now, the issue is you have some of this built in. Remember, your alveoli are where the air actually exchanges. Your bronchioles, bronchi, trachea, larynx, laryngopharynx, all of that is dead space. So when I exhale, the air currently filling my bronchioles, bronchi, trachea, etc., is air that was in my lungs already, stale air. When I breathe in, the first air that gets to my alveoli is that air, which was in my lungs before, stale air. We call this anatomical dead space. Depending on whether you're breathing in through your nose or not, it might even include the nasal cavity. Although you'd have to be exhaling through your nose for that to be an issue.
Does it include the laryngopharynx?
Yes, I'm not breaking down the pharynx.
Okay.
In most people, this amounts to about 150 milliliters of space. So that means every breath you take, there's that software police. Out of every breath you take, if you want to talk about how much useful fresh air gets to your alveoli, you have to subtract that 150 milliliters of anatomical dead space. It does mean that if I take extremely shallow breaths, if I just go, all I'm doing is moving air back and forth in my dead space. I'm getting effectively no fresh air, and I will suffocate doing that if I do it long enough. Yeah?
That's an adult body, right?
Yes. Yeah, and again, misogyny in science. Most of these values that are typical are more typical male. I don't know numbers for typical female. And honestly, there is not a truly typical. Probably they mean typical white male. And those may or may not vary in different populations. I wish I had better numbers to give you for worldwide averages. I apologize, I don't. But at least the least we can do is keep it in mind that this is not exactly representative. It is one group. This one does also vary by body size, although my guess is less so than lung volumes. These structures are not that different between people based on how big or small the person's body is. Not that much anyway. Okay, questions there?
I don't have a question about this, but I did notice we have total and alveolar relation about dead space. Is that here?
I'm gonna work that into this.
Okay, because I was
It's-
out of track.
No, it's in here, and I'm
Okay.
afraid we are going to have some calculations to do for that,
Okay.
but they're very simple. Okay. Somebody had a question.
I did, but then I thought about it and forgot it, and I'll think about it later.
If you come up with it, yeah, just throw it back out there. So this means that if we're talking about how much air a person breathes, we need to distinguish between, are we talking about the amount of air that goes through their nostrils or the amount of actual fresh air that gets to their lungs? That's the difference between total ventilation and alveolar ventilation.
Say that one more time.
So the difference between total and alveolar ventilation is, are we talking about how much air passes the person's nostrils?
Okay.
Or are we talking about how much useful air gets to their alveoli?
Oh, okay.
So for a single breath, under alveolar ventilation, you need to subtract the dead space. I'll give you an example. We have two individuals, Aosa and Baruch. Aosa takes 10 800 milliliter breaths every minute. Baruch takes 20 400 milliliter breaths every minute. I'd like you to calculate the total ventilation per minute for each of them. That is how much air total enters their body. And the alveolar ventilation over the minute, how much fresh air actually gets to their lungs. I'll calculate one of them for you, and then you can do the other one. So for Aosa, her total ventilation would just be how much she breathes per breath times the number of breaths in the minute.
8,000.
800 milliliters per breath times 10 breaths per minute is 8,000 milliliters per minute. That's her total ventilation. Her alveolar means we have to remove the dead space from each breath.
1,500.
So 800 minus 150 milliliters per breath times 10 breaths per minute. That's 650 per breath times 10 breaths per minute, 6,500 milliliters per minute, if I did my math right. Do the same for Baruch. Baruch? Hebrew, I think. Blessed. Okay. Ailsa is the name of the sister of my freshman roommate in college. I actually got Baruch from His Dark Materials. Has anybody read that trilogy? Is that not the best fantasy trilogy? Yeah. I am a serious sci-fi fantasy nerd, and I will tell you, on my shelf, next to Lord of the Rings, maybe above it, would be His Dark Materials. It is probably the single best fantasy trilogy I have ever read. Also has the interesting benefit, never mind. It's also one of the most heretical.
What's it called?
His Dark Materials. The first one is The Golden Compass. Do not watch the movie until you have read the book. Also in Britain, it's known as Northern Lights. Fan-freaking-tastic. Okay, so what do we get for Baruch? So what's his total? So 400 mils per breath times 20 breaths per minute gives us 8,000. The same as Ailsa, almost as if somebody were trying to make a point. But alveolar is 400 minus 150 times 20. Yep, 5,000. So they move the same amount of air into their bodies overall. But since Baruch is losing more of each of his breaths as a percentage to the dead space, he gets overall less useful air.
You get the second copy.
Of course. You could reduce this to an absurd value and say that somebody takes 80 100 milliliter breaths per minute. So they're going and figure out how much their alveolar ventilation is. 100 minus 150 gives you negative 50. That doesn't make any sense. You'd ignore the negative, so 0. So 0 per breath times 80 equals 0. They get no alveolar ventilation. Or take one 8,000 milliliter breath in a minute, which you can't do because your lungs aren't that big. But if you could, you'd have 7,850 milliliters of alveolar ventilation. Anyway, you get the idea. Slower, deeper breathing actually does make a difference. You make the slower and deeper you breathe, the more like outside air to some degree your alveolar air will be. Not that that's necessarily a good thing, and we'll talk about that a little later. We have this sense of, well, don't I want as much oxygen and as little CO2 in my alveoli as possible? And the answer is no, you do not. But we'll get to that.
So what about people who can freakishly hold their breath for extended amounts of time? So if obviously these are averages and there's obviously outliers, but saying that our bodies are only made to obtain a certain capacity and have an exchange rate. So are their bodies just, did they train their bodies like that, or are they just like, is that like a mutation that allows them to hold their breath?
I can't give you a definite answer, but so there are people both who seem just naturally able to hold their breath for a long time and people who practice doing it. Most people can extend the time they can hold their breath. From a little I've seen, most people can, without too much trouble, learn to hold their breath for somewhere between 1 to 2 minutes. I think the world record without hyperventilating on oxygen is something like 7 minutes.
Yeah. Well, because there's people in the Philippines who fish underwater.
Yeah.
And they just stay under there.
I'm not sure if that could be attributed to a genetics or not. I mean, there are different populations on Earth with different genetic traits. Sherpas utilize oxygen differently than people who live at lower elevations. Whether particular groups on the Pacific Islands might have an extended ability to hold their breath from that, could be. Probably depends on how long they've been doing that and how much genetic input there is from other groups that don't do that. But with practice, you see, it seems that people can train their body to lower its rate of oxygen use and CO2 production dramatically, so that you can reduce how much of that air in your alveoli you're using, make it last longer.
What about people who sing, who are, like, they can hold a note for an extended amount of time, but then talking, and they can say they just pick a pitch and they talk at it and then they sing at it, and they can extend it longer when they're singing it. What's the difference between that?
Again, I can't give you a definite answer. I know that one of the major points in singing is control of the breath. And one of the things that makes you feel a need to breathe in, is CO2 buildup. One thing that singers will tell you is that if you want to hold a note, you do not hold your breath in.
Yeah.
Your breath actually has to come out. And sometimes it feels like the more it comes out, the easier it is, which seems paradoxical.
Yeah.
That may have to do with getting rid of the CO2 in your alveoli as much as anything else. So I can't give you a great answer, but that's my guess. Also, probably that singing training, since you are training on breath control, may also affect how your body deals with times when you aren't breathing. But I don't know. That's actually probably an interesting study if no one's ever done it before. Might be interesting to watch a pulse oximeter on somebody who's a trained singer versus not while they're doing that. Other questions? Okay. You can assume that some sort of calculation like this will show up on the exam. So it's something like this. This is not terribly hard. You can do this. All right, take 5.